Hey everyone, this unit we're going to be focusing on the audience and purpose section of the rhetorical strategies or rhetorical situations that we talked about in class. So that means we're going to be digging deeply into how do I adapt to my audience and how do I make sure that my purpose is clear. To prepare us for that, I just wanted to highlight some information a little bit more deeply than when we did the broad rhetoric lecture. So, as we've already discussed it multiple times in class, rhetorical situations are constantly changing, meaning we're constantly adapting how we're communicating and what we're communicating moment to moment, situation to situation. And in college, a lot of the times the assignments we do in English class or communication class, really a lot of classes, are trying to help you understand the material, but then also the practice writing or communicating that material. And so knowing your audience and knowing your purpose will help you with that as well. So every piece of communication has a purpose to it. Commonly, maybe you were trying to entertain, maybe you're trying to persuade someone, maybe you're trying to demonstrate knowledge or inform. At times we're trying to reflect. But we have an initial purpose behind this. And yes, I recognize that when you're in class, your initial purpose is I'm doing it to get a grade so I can pass the class. But let's go a little bit deeper than that as well. And it can be common to have more than one purpose at a time. I might be trying to demonstrate my knowledge, but while also convincing you to try something in a new way. Or maybe I'm trying to entertain you, but through this funny story, I'm also reflecting on what I went through. So maybe your purpose in your communication is multifaceted, but you want to make sure that you know what it is. Because if we don't know what our purpose is, we don't know how to proceed well. It's hard to be clear with our communication if we don't know what we're doing. There are a couple of questions you can ask. You can ask yourself, what do you want the audience to do, think, or feel? What does the task ask you to do? And what is the best way to achieve this? So that is our purpose. That's what we're doing to make sure that we know why we're communicating and how we can best communicate. And then as we're communicating, we make sure, okay, does this actually sound persuasive? Is this actually entertaining? Am I really demonstrating my knowledge? And if the answer is yes, then you know you're crafting your communication well. The other aspect we're going to be looking at this unit is your audience, because very rarely are we communicating just for ourselves. Yes, I recognize that we could have a diary or a journal or something like that, and that is very personal and self-reflective, but most of our communication we're going to be partaking in this class and then partaking in our future careers is related to communicating with someone else, to an audience. So we have to think about our audience when crafting our communication, whether it's written or oral or visual, because we have to think about what I'm going to write, how much I'm going to write, how am I going to phrase things, and how am I actually communicating? Is it written? Am I speaking to them? Am I making a visual diagram? So once I know my purpose, I then move naturally into who is my audience and how can I best communicate with them. And remember though that our audience's experience and experiences and background will also impact their interpretation of you. So if, let's say you're an automotive technician and you have a customer come into your shop and last shop they worked closely with, the person misled them and made them sound like there's all these things wrong with the car, that if they didn't fix them it was gonna be gonna explode on them, but it really wasn't. It just was long-term maintenance that would be a good idea, but they got bullied and pressured into spending maybe an extra $1,000 on something, and then they found out later no, I really didn't need this. That perspective may have them a little less willing to believe you, and so you might have to be able to counter that and try to show your trustworthiness with maybe evidence and break it down clearly for them. Again, that may be an extreme example, but it's a good example of how sometimes the audience's background is going to impact the way they think and interact with you, and we can't always stop that from causing communication to not go as well, but we can try to prepare for it and have ways of communicating around that. As you are crafting your communication, and the reason I'm saying crafting communication is because remember this class is about oral and written communication. So either way you're doing it, make sure that you keep the needs of your audience in mind, kind of envision them. So we're going to do an activity where I have you basically create a fake audience, and you're going to have to keep them in mind as you move forward. And that's coming up a little bit later, but like sometimes that's helpful to think about, like, really who could this be, and flesh it out a little bit. There are 3 types of audience you may encounter. The first is the known audience. So that's an audience that you're familiar with their needs, you're familiar with their expectations. So if it's a regular customer coming into the shop, you know them, you know how they communicate, how they think, how they work, and you can just. Sometimes you have multiple audiences, so maybe more than one type of person or group is going to interact with your communication. So maybe you're sending out a flyer, right? So that could be going to a known audience of your actual customers, but it could be going to an unknown audience of customers you haven't quite reached. So how can you adapt there to make sure to hit both of them? People who already know you and familiar, still keep their attention, but then also people who wouldn't know you, how can you like bring them into that moment? And then unknown audience would be someone or that you don't really know, you have no experience with, and so you have to kind of keep it really vague in general when you're thinking about how to apply them. This was going to rely a little bit more on like the idea of stereotypes, like, okay, in general, this type of person might be into XYZ. And that's okay to have to like generalize until you get to know the person, because at least it gives you a starting point. Now, we don't want to take that to the extreme, but in general, most, if we're thinking about it, like maybe most students are going to want XYZ. And I could start with that until I got to know my students better and then adapt to fit them personally, right? So how this impacts class, by the way, is even if it's a fictional assignment, like your project you're going to do this semester, and you'll watch a video about that later, even if it's fictional, still like build for them, but in the back of your mind be thinking about like what I might want to see. And so that comes into maybe like your grammar and spelling and reflection and all that. So you're going to kind of have like a dual audience as well as a dual purpose here, but I promise you're going to be fine. As a communicator, we do have to look past our own experiences, beliefs, and self-interest when it comes to our audience. So that way we consider theirs as well as ours, because they may not match. And so that may mean you have to be able to put aside your preference and match someone else's preference. Your tone, so that's your like attitude, the emotion behind it, should also match your audience and purpose. So are you going to be formal or informal? Do you need to be more serious, or can you be laid back? There's also emotional meanings behind words. That's called connotation. So house versus home. When we call something home, like it normally has more of that, like we feel typically, again, not the same for everyone I recognize, but maybe feel like safe. It's a place where you can relax and be your true self, versus a house that's just a building that you go into, right? So think about those as well. If you're in a situation where you want people to take you seriously, avoid sarcasm. Be even-tempered and calm, right? Because if you're being overly sarcastic or intense in emotion, whatever that emotion is, sometimes people won't take you as seriously because they don't know if, like, has this really been thought through? And so all of that can be conveyed in terms of your tone, like how seriously you want to be taken through the words you use, which is why it's important we pay attention to how we craft what we're doing. So as I said, in this unit, we are focusing on audience and purpose, and we're going to do some activities with that, and your next project is built around you adapting the same communication need into a different audience and a different purpose.